Good morning and most welcome to 1367 of the Heidegger series. And I will continue where I left off in 1366. Stephen M. Rosen's 2021 paper, The Strange Nature of Quantum Perception. To see a photon, one must be a photon. And I will continue where I left off in 1366. It's page 234 in this rather extensive article. It's a whopping 40 pages. I will have the privilege to talk to said Rosen pretty soon here. I made contact with him and we're going to communicate over the internet. So it sounds very interesting to go into one of his more recent articles. It's the first paragraph. Of course, the long dominant paradigm of mind independence was not simply relinquished. Just as a semblance of continuity could be maintained in confronting quantum discontinuity. A way was found to maintain mind-independent objectivity when confronted with the quantum level intimacy of subject and object. There is a substantial difference between pre-quantum and quantum versions of the classical posture. In the former, we have objective events occurring in three-dimensional space. Before the detached gaze of an idealized subject. In the latter, where the observer's close involvement with the observed cannot merely be discounted. Subjectivity itself is taken as object. With the object now being regarded as an observational event transpiring in n-dimensional Hilbert space. Whereas three-dimensional events are concretely observable. The dimensions of Hilbert space are sheer abstractions. And the idealized quantum observer of these n-dimensional acts of observation is a further step removed from the concrete reality that constrained his Newtonian predecessors. Nevertheless, in both cases, the traditional stance is strictly maintained. In both, we have object in space before subject. My comment here is, this is usually not pointed out, and it's well worth thinking of that sort of, so to speak, Newtonian space do sneak in into that quantum realm. Thus, objectivist quantum mechanics implicitly transforms the old subject into an object cast before a more abstract, higher order subject. In effect, the quantum mechanical researcher assumes a subordinate vantage point from which he is able to consider alternative acts of classical observation. And weigh them probabilistically. With each act corresponding to a different subspace of the Hilbert space. Here the objects to be analyzed are not mere concrete substances, but observations themselves. What Max Planck called the run of our perceptions. If the scientific objectivity of the quantum mechanical analysis of observation is to be maintained, the implicit observational activity of the analyst of observation must itself be exempted from the analysis. That is to say, two ontologically distinct levels of observational or subjective activity have to exist. That which is to be analyzed and that through which the analysis is to take place. That is to say, two ontologically distinct levels of observational or subjective activity have to exist. That which is to be analyzed and that through which the analysis is to take place. This is so important, I will slowly repeat it. This is the pivot line. That is to say, two ontologically distinct levels of observational or subjective activity have to exist. One, that which is to be analyzed, and that through which the analysis is to take place. This parallels contained and uncontained. The former is constituted by the old subjective activity, that is now objectified within the framework of the Hilbert space. Whereas the latter corresponds to the more abstract, higher order, wholly implicit activity of the quantum mechanical subject standing outside of Hilbert space. It is clear that this subject assumes the same detached, purely objective stance as did his Newtonian forerunner. Still operative in its essential relations is the basic formula of object in space before subject. Though the natural intuitive appeal the formula had held in the classical context, is now stretched into a counterintuitive abstraction that, in the end, found us on the rocks of quantum gravity, as I intimated above. Summing up, the quantum world entails a loss of spatial continuity, coupled with an intimate fusion of subject and object. that defies the classical order and its underlying objectivist paradigm. We have seen the means used by physicists to resuscitate this paradigm. And I have questioned the effectiveness of these attempts. My conclusion is that the objectivist, mind-independent tradition does not appear equal to the task of accounting for quantum reality. What can we say about the mind-dependent interpretation of quantum mechanics? This approach to modern physics puts mind before matter in attempting to understand the quantum world. Thus, according to the von Neumann-Wigner hypothesis, consciousness is necessary for collapsing the quantum wave. And in John Wheeler's 1990 hypothesis, the physical universe arises from information. How has the mind-dependent view been received by the scientific community. In 2011, an informal poll was conducted of physicists, mathematicians, and philosophers. Attending a physics conference, and it was found that of the 33 participants, only 2 were favorably disposed toward mind dependence. So interesting, I just mentioned there's a link here, Schlosshauer et al. 2013. Why the distinct lack of enthusiasm for this view? I noted above that the mind-independent paradigm is aligned with our everyday experience of reality as lying objectively out there. Because the contrasting mind-dependent approach posits the equal or superordinate reality of the mind in here. It runs counter to common sense intuition and is therefore harder to accept. But the objection to the mind-dependent perspective runs deeper than that. If the mind-dependent notion that consciousness causes wave collapse is taken in the dualistic spirit of Cartesian interactionism, the notorious mind-body problem arises. How can such ontologically disparate entities as mind and matter interact. How is it possible for an entity without extension in space, res cogitans, to exert an influence on an entity extended in space, res extensa? Descartes offered no convincing explanation for how this could happen, nor has any been provided since his time. Nevertheless, the mind-dependent view may alternatively be seen as an expression of the monistic philosophy of immaterialism. Direct metaphysical assertions of this doctrine have sometimes been met with skepticism and even dismissed as quantum quackery. This is coming from Michael Shermer, 2005. At least in part because many physicists find it uncomfortable to place physics squarely within an overarching metaphysical or religious context. A more subtle form of immaterialism was noted above. One that is more acceptable to mainstream physicists. John Wheeler's it from bit proposition that the material world is built up from immaterial units of information. As Wheeler puts it, every physical entity, quantity, every it derives its ultimate significance from bits. Binary yes or no indications. A conclusion we epitomize in the phrase it from bit. Philosopher Christopher Timson examines this proposition at length. Timson begins by noticing that on first appraisal, an informational approach to quantum mechanics does seem to resolve its central problem of measurement. He gives as an example the thought experiment known as Wigner's friend. Physicist Eugene Wigner has a colleague doing an experiment with particles in a closed laboratory. Wigner himself is outside the laboratory. When his friend reaches the point of measuring the spin state of a particle, the superposition of particle states collapses accordingly to yield a definite outcome. But Wegener himself is not privy to this finding, so that for him the particle states are still in superposition. The question then concerns the time at which the superposition collapses. Was it when a friend made this his measurement, or was it later when Wegener became aware of the result? As Timson puts it, does Wegener's friend see a definite outcome, or is he held in limbo until Wegener opens the door to say hello? This is the kind of paradox that arises when the quantum state is taken as representing how things are in the world. But if we take it to mean representing the information somebody possesses, the paradox evidently dissolves. There is no disagreement on when the collapse objectively occurs, because the collapse is not taken as occurring objectively out there in the world. Wegener and his friend simply have access to different information. And when Wegener's friend tells him what he has observed, Wegener will update what he knows about the quantum state. This will occasion no mysterious change out in the world, since the update strictly concerns the information one has. Having laid out the informational interpretation in this way, Thomson goes on to express his doubts. Echoing physicist John Bell, Thomson suggests the necessity of asking what quantum mechanical information is about. If it is simply about what the outcome of experiments will be, then we slide back into the Copenhagen school's non-committal instrumentalist approach to the meaning of the quantum world. Which Thomson rightly finds uninteresting. The other alternative is that the information is about the properties of a system which are possessed prior to measurement and which are not described by the quantum state. In this case, because the state does not have a world-describing role. Incredibly important. properties of a system which are possessed prior to measurement and which are not described by the quantum state. In this case, because the state does not have a world describing rule. I think I put a little summary there, it's so important. Rosen here goes to the very important point. I think all of you have met upon the problematic experiment of Wigner's friend. But to think about it as information, and that two participants, for obvious reasons, have different information, is the simplest, clearest and most telling solution. And I think this also brings an understanding that there's still in many people's minds, as Rosen mentioned, of a Congress of 33, not even a handful had been able to rid themselves from the persistent idea of something out there that is determinate and carrying information in some spooky way. Here we see clearly in the very experiment that we dissolve the problem by viewing it as information. A rather elegant solution. Before I continue, my dear colleague Kalle here, I will hand over the microphone. It's a bit stuck here in my t-shirt. Give it some light. There you go.
Hello, hello. So Rosen discusses Wheeler, and Wheeler has made great contributions, like when the superposition collapses, you have also the history. So quantum physics creates a history. If it's, for instance, the cat, which has collapsed, you can see it has an 8-hour history, for instance. But on the other hand, Wheeler also thought that information is like small bits that you put together, as Rosen puts it. And for many today, information and realities like that, it's like these yes or no indications, as Wheeler describes it. So Wheeler, although he made these great contributions, his reality is small bits, if I understood it correctly. Hans, you have to correct me. And please.
Yes, you are in the right ballpark. you are zooming in on where the problem is, and also the most elegant indication of a solution here. Sort of takes away a little bit of the mysterious and spooky character of quantum mechanics. So yes, I'll continue or continue from there. Let's see. Rosen views this interpretation of quantum information as implicitly leading us back to the search for variables hidden within the probabilistic quantum state. For Timson, such a move is self-defeating because hidden variables have been found to behave very boldly. Displaying non-locality and contextuality. And the whole point of taking the quantum state as information was to mollify its bad behavior. It's jumping here and there. We know not when it's non-local collapse. Timson's final conclusion. The informational approach to the quantum state seems unable to survive the hidden variables instrumentalism dilemma. And he thought that quantum information theory does lend support to a form of immaterialism really seems to have very little to commend it. The Husserlian interpretation in the previous section I mentioned a different version of the mind-dependent view, namely the von Neumann-Wigner view of quantum mechanics. Which was further developed by Wigner. The idea commonly attributed to Wigner is that the physical quantum wave is collapsed by non-physical consciousness. In the absence of any real understanding of how this could happen, the action of consciousness takes on the appearance of operating as a phantasmal deus ex machina. Inexplicably swooping in to effect change in the material world. Thus it seemed to many physicists that with approaches like Wigner's, the spectre of Cartesian interactionism haunts the scene. philosopher Stephen French challenges this reading of Wigner's position. According to French, criticism of Wigner has been based on the mistaken assumption that in speaking of the action of consciousness, Wigner was adhering to the naive mind-body dualism in which consciousness acts on the physical world outside of it. French maintains that, in fact, Wigner had been influenced by the phenomenological philosophy of Husserl, wherein consciousness is regarded as acting immanently. In French's interpretation of Wigner, consciousness enters the quantum experiment not as some phantom from beyond, but through the auspices of the experiment's objectifying act of reflection. French holds that in observing the quantum system, the observer is introspectively aware of herself doing so, and through observing herself in relation to the system being observed, she objectifies that system. I.e., reduces the wave function to a definite value. To support this view, French cites London and Bauer. The phenomenologically oriented physicist who had influenced Wigner's outlook. It is not a mysterious interaction between the apparatus and the object that produces a new Y for the system during the measurement. It is only the consciousness of an I who can separate himself from the former function psi. And by virtue of his observation set up a new objectivity in attributing to the object henceforward a new function, y, x, end of quote. By thus internalizing consciousness, it appears to be brought into the quantum picture without falling prey to the problem of Cartesian interaction. This is surely an important step in addressing the shortcomings of the old realist paradigm. The classical inability to account for the action of consciousness on matter is phenomenologically remedied by regarding consciousness and the quantum system as correlated pools. However, I venture to suggest in the Husserlian approach to phenomenology there is a sense in which the old paradigm actually persists. I pointed out earlier that when physicists were confronted with the radical interaction of subject and object found in the quantum world, rather than relinquish the objectivist worldview upon which science had been built, they introduced a form of objectivism in which the subject was transformed into a new object. One implicitly cast before a higher order subject. With the objectifying act of reflection carried out in the Husserlian quantum laboratory. A subtler version of the same sort of objectification is evidently enacted. I just need to stretch my leg for a second. Could you put a short pause there? Sorry, I just needed to stretch a bit. Proponents of traditional objectivism might be inclined to view Husserlian phenomenology as a lapse into fuzzy subjectification, subjectivism. This cannot be further from the truth. Husserl was in fact seeking greater objectivity than what had been achieved in the natural sciences. In advocating philosophy as a rigorous science, he saw naturalism as contradicting itself because it operates subjectively to project an external reality that is then naively assumed to be simply independent of its subjective action. My comment here, this sentence is just to the point. Excellency.
Can you repeat it?
Husserl, 1911 / later edition 1965, page 71. He saw naturalism as contradicting itself because it operates subjectively to project an external reality that is then naively assumed to be simply independent of its subjective action. The projection must be withdrawn, says Husserl. In a fully objective science, objectivity must precisely become evident purely from consciousness itself. As regards the objectifying act of reflection that takes place in the quantum laboratory, according to the Husserlian interpretation, consciousness applies itself to itself so as to collapse the quantum wave. Elsewhere, I demonstrated that such a self-objectification entails an implicit re-subjectification. In rejecting empirical objectivism, Husserl dispenses with the exterior space set objectivism requires for the observation and measurement of its objects. He replaces the external dimension with a wholly interior one, a space to be known through intuition rather than through sense perception. One that is neither physical nor empirically psychological, but purely logical. A space wherein the perfectly self-consistent operations of consciousness are enacted. Of course, it is consciousness itself that is to observe these operations. Therefore, the observation in question is a self-observation. An intuitive self-reflection. And yet, the all-categorial division of subject and object is still at play in this immanent realm. For to know anything objectively, the knower or subject must be detached from what he knows. A little comment there. We went into that subject with a seer, and on my comment. In the paradigm upon which scientific objectivism relies, the containment of an object in space and the detachment of the subject from that object are integral aspects of the same process. By the same act in which the object is sealed in space, the subject is sealed out, separated from that object. No less does this apply to Husserl's phenomenological version of scientific objectivism. If Husserl's transcendental subject is to gain purely apodictic knowledge of its object, which in this case is itself, it must become detached from that object. The internal division of consciousness into subject as object and subject as subject is implied in Lauer's 1965 comment that for Husserlian phenomenology, it is the object, not the subject, that determines what science must be. And that it is the character of what is to be known, not the character of the knower, that makes phenomenology the only viable philosophical method. Note the limitation of Husserlian intuition that results from its objectivism. It cannot take in the actual process by which it splits itself into subject and object. Subject as object and subject as subject. Its grasp is restricted to the object alone, which appears only after the division has occurred. The act of division itself is thus not open to intuitive inquiry, but is simply presupposed. Husserlian reflection confines itself to consciousness as objective content. As the objectified subject contained in the interior logical space. That has been established. It is in this way that the phenomenal logical cogito is divided with one part of it the part to be investigated constituting an interior logical object. And the other part of it, that doing the investigation. Entailing a new higher order subjectivity that goes uninvestigated. The end result of this is the establishment of a regress that guarantees the incompleteness of Husserl's phenomenological reduction. For in the attempt to reach objective closure on the transcendental subject, via the division of consciousness, subjectivity forever evades the grasp of intuition. What are the implications of Husserlian objectivism for the question of quantum measurement? In the macroscopic quantum laboratory, as understood by Stephen French, the intuitive act of self-objectification collapses the quantum wave. Yet even though this allows the conclusion that consciousness is the agent of collapse and avoids the problem of Cartesian interaction in drawing this conclusion, it gives us no intuitive grasp of what is actually being collapsed, the quantum wave per se. That is because the submicroscopic quantum system defies that to which Husserlian intuition is limited, the macroscopic field of strictly objective relations. We know by now that at the heart of quantum reality is a heretical overlapping of subject and object, that no form of objectivism is fully equipped to deal with. Husserlian phenomenology is no exception. But there is an alternative approach to phenomenology that may be better suiting for plumbing the quantum depths. And this approach may suggest a mode of perception that can be employed effectively with the extension of perceptual experience to the micro-world anticipated in the opening of this paper. I will make a summary here. Let's see if I get it down a bit here. "26 today."
Yes.
Finally, after all these years, I'm starting to get a grasp of Edmund Husserl's phenomenological reduction and what he's trying to strive for. And also this golden sentence that there is a subjective projection within thinking itself that has not been uncovered before his objective investigation. Edmund Husserl dwelled incredibly deep into the matter and surgically discovered an inherent subjective factor in the creation of the object-subject. The one holding the thought is also in on it. In my own words, it would be a very important part of the equation has been left out and clearly exposed by Husserl to be shown to be utterly subjective. Possibly this is the very reason why so few scientists are willing to back up observer dependency. It is lurking underneath the surface of what is generally known and seen. Usually we instinctively assume that holding an objective thought is enough to make it entirely objective, that we become cleansed, healed from subjectivity by the character of the assumed objectivity of the thought proposition. And that is not correct. There is no magical objective potion in the words, in the thought, that can heal us from the most detested subjectivity. A very clear exposure of a magnificently discovered disjunct in the history of thought. Speaking of thoughts, maybe there are a few thoughts coming from my colleague Kalle Lundahl here. I give him the microphone and I give you some light as well.
So let me...
Just give me a second here so we can see you.
We have although it's winter in Sweden, we have the first day with sun since several weeks.
Months.
It's coming on my face. And I will repeat the golden sentence from page 238. If I'm able to see it from the light. So Husserl, who was advocating philosophy as rigorous science, saw naturalism as contradicting itself because it operates subjectively to project an external reality that is then naively assumed to be simply independent of its subjective action. And that is, in fact, the problem with physics today, science today, and also the human sciences. So that they imagine that there is an objective reality, okay, but then they forget that it's actually the subject who's doing that observation. And there is another, besides the division between subject and object, you have some other things that people forget. Time. And when you do the observation, there is time involved. Some way you forget that. People forget that. That's okay. After the fact, you can say it was independent of me. So that is the two things that what is wrong with science today. That the naturalist contradicts itself because it operates subjectively to project an external reality that is naively assumed to be simply independent of its subjective action. Just a great sentence. Thank you, Rosen. And Hans, do you want to add?
I am very grateful to Rosen for this, and I was pondering my head back in '94 with these things under Professor Eva Mark many years ago, and I never understood the phenomenological reduction until I read this. Few times I've been so curious of what will come next in the exposure of Stephen Rosen, but that will have to wait until 1368. Thank you very much for your comments, very apt, very clear, and have a very nice morning. Bye bye for now.
Thank you.